For years, the world was told a simple story, that Vladimir Putin's greatest fear was NATO, that every Russian move, every speech, every threat, every missile test was driven by the fear of Western expansion, that NATO tanks, NATO bases, and NATO flags moving closer to Russia's borders were the ultimate red line. But today, that story no longer explains what we are seeing, because Russia is no longer behaving like a state terrified of NATO armies rolling east. It is behaving like a system afraid of something much closer, something internal, something structural, something it can't bomb, sanction, or threaten into submission. And that shift matters far more than any troop movement in Eastern Europe. Over the last year, Russia has launched thousands of missiles and drones. It has mobilized hundreds of thousands of men. It has poured enormous resources into a war meant to prove strength, resolve, and endurance. Yet despite all of this, the Kremlin's language has quietly changed. Russian officials speak less about NATO invasion, less about Western troops crossing borders, and more about stability, control, internal security, economic resilience, information discipline. Those are not the words of a leadership focused on external enemies. They are the words of a system worried about what is happening inside its own walls. Because history shows something uncomfortable. Authoritarian states rarely collapse because of foreign armies. They collapse when internal pressure builds faster than the system can absorb. When logistics strain, when institutions lose credibility, when the cost of control becomes higher than the cost of reform, and reform is no longer possible. And in modern wars, that pressure does not arrive all at once. It arrives quietly, through budgets, through manpower shortages, through public silence that slowly turns into private doubt. The Ukraine war has accelerated all of those pressures, not because Russia is losing every battle, but because the war is exposing limits the Russian system was never designed to handle. This is not about battlefield maps. It is about sustainability. Can Russia maintain a high-intensity war while keeping its economy functional? Can it replace advanced weapons faster than they are used? Can it suppress social fatigue without breaking the social contract entirely? And most importantly, can the Kremlin manage a long war without losing control of the narrative inside Russia itself? That is the fear replacing NATO. Not tanks crossing borders, but cracks forming at home. For decades, NATO served a useful purpose for the Kremlin. It was a clear external enemy, a simple explanation for domestic hardship, a justification for military spending and political control. NATO expansion was real, but its military threat was often exaggerated for internal consumption, because fear of NATO unified elites, justified repression, and rallied public support. But the Ukraine war changed the equation. NATO did not directly intervene with troops. Western weapons arrived, but under limits. No-fly zones were avoided. Red lines were carefully managed. And instead of triggering a NATO war, Russia found itself locked in a grinding conflict with a single country, one supported, but not fought for by the West. That reality exposed something uncomfortable. If NATO was truly the existential threat, then why was the war not escalating into direct confrontation? The answer forced a strategic reassessment. Russia was not fighting NATO armies. It was fighting time. And time is a far more dangerous enemy for systems built on centralized control. Modern wars punish inefficiency. Every missile fired has a replacement cost. Every mobilized soldier has an economic absence. Every sanction reshapes supply chains in ways that are difficult to reverse. Russia entered the war assuming speed would compensate for inefficiency. That assumption failed. Now the Kremlin faces a different problem. Not how to defeat NATO, but how to keep its own system functioning under prolonged stress. Air defense systems must protect infrastructure across vast territory. Energy networks must stay operational. Transportation corridors must function despite drone strikes and sabotage. None of these problems are solved by nuclear deterrence. They are solved, or fail, through logistics, maintenance, and institutional competence. And those are areas where prolonged war quietly erodes capacity. Putin's biggest fear is no longer NATO missiles or NATO troops. It is endurance failure, a slow erosion of control, a war that doesn't end dramatically, but doesn't end at all. A system forced to adapt faster than it was designed to. This does not guarantee collapse, but it explains the Kremlin's behavior far better than old Cold War narratives, because the most dangerous threats are rarely the loudest ones. They are the quiet pressures that never stop. For years, Russia prepared for a war that never came. NATO tanks never rolled toward Moscow. Western armies never crossed Russian borders. No massive invasion ever happened. But while Russia watched the horizon, something far more dangerous was growing inside the system. A fear that could not be bombed, a threat that could not be deterred, a collapse that no missile could stop. And slowly, painfully, the Kremlin began to realize something terrifying. Putin's biggest enemy was no longer outside Russia, it was inside. The war that drained everything. Modern wars are not won by slogans. They are won by systems, supply chains, maintenance cycles, trained manpower, command discipline, economic endurance. Ukraine did not defeat Russia by overpowering it. Ukraine defeated Russia by forcing it to bleed slowly. Every destroyed tank forced Russia to pull another from storage. Every lost aircraft exposed shortages of trained pilots. Every missile launch revealed how limited production really was. Russia's military looked large on paper, but war exposed the truth. The system was hollow. For decades, Russia projected strength through numbers. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, endless artillery, but quantity only matters when quality survives time. What the war revealed shocked even Russian insiders. Stored tanks were rusted, electronics were outdated, spare parts were missing, maintenance records were falsified, entire armored units existed only in reports. The myth collapsed under inspection. The officer crisis. Wars are not fought by machines alone. They are fought by leadership. And this is where Russia suffered its most dangerous loss. Experienced officers died at the front. Commanders were forced to expose themselves because junior officers lacked authority. Decisions slowed. Coordination failed. Fear replaced initiative. When soldiers stop trusting leadership, discipline collapses. And discipline is the backbone of any army. The economic war Russia cannot win. Missiles cost money. Fuel costs money. Repairs cost money. Sanctions didn't need to destroy Russia's economy overnight. They only needed to limit replacement speed. Every month of war became more expensive than the last. Factories worked slower. Imports dried up. Precision components became scarce. Russia could still fight, but it could not fight forever. This is the key moment. Russia did not stop fearing NATO because NATO became weak. Russia stopped fearing NATO because Russia became weaker. When survival is uncertain, external threats become secondary. The Kremlin's focus shifted from borders to stability, from expansion to control, from dominance to endurance. Fear moved inward. Every prolonged war creates fractures. Mobilization angered families. Economic pressure strained cities. Regional resentment increased. The war created winners and losers inside Russia, and those who lost began asking dangerous questions. Why are we paying the price? Who benefits from this war? How long will it last? These questions are far more dangerous than NATO tanks. The Kremlin controls media, but it cannot control reality. Soldiers returned wounded. Families noticed missing payments. Funerals increased. Official narratives began to crack. People didn't need Western media. They only needed to look around. When truth leaks through everyday life, propaganda loses power. Authoritarian systems fear one thing above all else: precedent. If failure is acknowledged once, it can be acknowledged again. If criticism is tolerated once, it spreads. If weakness is admitted once, authority fractures. The Kremlin knows this. That's why fear dominates decision-making. Not NATO, not Ukraine, but loss of control. Many believe escalation means confidence. In reality, escalation often signals desperation. When options narrow, leaders take risks. Every escalation is a gamble, and Russia's leadership knows the stakes. Too much force risks backlash. Too little force risks defeat. This balance becomes harder with every passing month. and wars stop being about battles. At some point, wars stop being decided only on the battlefield. They move into ministries, into intelligence services, into private conversations between elites. This is where Russia is now. The fighting in Ukraine continues, but the deeper consequences are unfolding elsewhere, inside Russia's political and power structure. And this is the phase that has historically proven most dangerous for long-standing leaders. The Kremlin's greatest fear: losing control of the story. Authoritarian systems depend on narrative control. For years, the Kremlin managed this carefully. Victories were amplified, losses were minimized, failures were blamed on outsiders. But Ukraine changed the information environment. The war could not be hidden. Videos circulated online. Families saw casualties firsthand. Soldiers spoke privately, and sometimes publicly. The gap between official statements and reality grew too large to ignore. And when people stop believing the story, they start questioning the system. One common misunderstanding is how regimes fall. Elites rarely overthrow leaders out of anger. They do it out of fear. Fear of being associated with failure. Fear of losing wealth. Fear of being the last to jump. Russia's elites are not emotional. They are pragmatic. And wars that go badly force calculations. Who will be blamed? Who will be protected? Who will survive politically? These questions are now being asked quietly, but constantly. In stable authoritarian systems, security services are unified. In unstable ones, they compete. Russia's war has increased pressure on military intelligence, internal security agencies, National Guard forces. Each institution wants to avoid responsibility for failure. Each wants to remain indispensable. This creates mistrust. And mistrust weakens coordination. When security institutions start watching each other instead of external threats, the system becomes fragile. One of the most alarming developments has been the rise of powerful private military formations. These groups recruit independently, operate with their own command structures, publicly criticize state leadership. This breaks a fundamental rule of authoritarian control. The state must always control organized violence. When it doesn't, power fragments. Public criticism by armed actors is not just noise. Delta is a signal that fear has limits. Many ask a simple question: why doesn't Putin just stop? The answer is strategic. Confirm military failure, undermine deterrence, weaken Russia's global position. But continuing the war drains resources and morale. This is the classic trap of prolonged conflict. Victory is unreachable, defeat is unacceptable. So the war continues, by default. Military collapse does not happen in isolation. It intersects with the economy. Sanctions restrict technology. Revenue becomes unpredictable. Military spending increases dramatically.